The Americans, Chapter 25, The United States in World War II, Section 1, Mobilizing for Defense. Charles Swanson looked all over his army base for a tape recorder on which to play the tape his wife had sent him for Christmas. In desperation, he later recalled, "I had it played over the public address system. It was a little embarrassing to have the whole company hear it, but it made everyone long for home." A personal voice, Mrs. Charles Swanson. "Merry Christmas, honey. Surprised? I'm so glad I have a chance to say hello to you this way on our first Christmas apart. About our little girl, she is just big enough to fill my heart and strong enough to help Mommy bear this ache of loneliness. Her dearest treasure is her daddy's picture. It's all marked with tiny handprints, and the glass is always cloudy from so much loving and kissing. I'm hoping you'll be listening to this on Christmas Eve, somewhere over there, your heart full of hope, faith, and courage, knowing each day will bring that next Christmas together, one day nearer." As the United States began to mobilize for war, the Swansons, like most Americans, had few illusions as to what lay ahead. It would be a time filled with hard work, hope, sacrifice, and sorrow. Part 1. Americans join the war effort. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor with the expectation that once Americans had experienced Japan's power, they would shrink from further conflict. The day after the raid, the Japan Times boasted that the United States, now reduced to a third-rate power, was trembling in her shoes. But if Americans were trembling, it was with rage, not fear. Uniting under the battle cry, "Remember Pearl Harbor!" they set out to prove Japan wrong. Selective service and the GI. After Pearl Harbor, eager young Americans jammed recruiting offices. "I wanted to be a hero, let's face it," admitted Roger Tuttrup. "I was having trouble in school. The war had been going on for 2 years. I didn't want to miss it. I was an American. I was 17. Even the 5 million who volunteered for military service, however, were not enough to face the challenge of an all-out war on 2 global fronts, Europe and the Pacific. The selective service system expanded the draft and eventually provided another 10 million soldiers to meet the armed forces' needs. The volunteers and draftees reported to military bases around the country for 8 weeks of basic training. In this short period, seasoned sergeants did their best to turn raw recruits into disciplined battle-ready GIs. According to Sergeant Debs Myers, however, there was more to basic training than teaching a recruit how to stand at attention, march in step, handle a rifle, and follow orders. A personal voice, Sergeant Debs Myers. "The civilians went before the army doctors, took off his clothes, feeling silly, jiggled, stooped, squatted, wet into a bottle, became a soldier. He learned how to sleep in the mud, tie a knot, kill a man. He learned the ache of loneliness, the ache of exhaustion, the kinship of misery. He learned that men make the same queasy noises in the morning, feel the same longings at night, and that every man is alike, and that each man is different." Expanding the military. The military's workforce needs were so great that the Army Chief of Staff, General George Marshall, pushed for the formation of a Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, or WAC. There are innumerable duties now being performed by soldiers that can be done better by women," Marshall said in support of a bill to establish the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. Under this bill, women volunteers would serve in non-combat positions. Despite opposition from some members of Congress who scorned the bill as the silliest piece of legislation they had ever seen, the bill establishing the WAC became law on May 15, 1942. The law gave way to WACs as gave the WACs an official status and salary, but few of the benefits granted to male soldiers. In July 1943, after thousands of women had enlisted, the U.S. Army dropped the auxiliary status and granted WACs full U.S. Army benefits. WACs worked as nurses, ambulance drivers, radio operators, electricians, and pilots, nearly every duty not involving direct combat. Recruiting and discrimination. For many minority groups, especially African Americans, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and Asian Americans, the war created new dilemmas. Restricted to racially segregated neighborhoods and reservations, and denied basic citizenship rights, some members of these groups questioned whether this was their war to fight. Why die for democracy for some foreign country when we don't even have it here? Asked an editorial in an African American newspaper. On receiving his draft notice, an African American responded unhappily, "Just carve on my tombstone, here lies a black man killed fighting a yellow man for the protection of a white man." Dramatic contributions. Despite discrimination in the military, more than 300,000 Mexican Americans joined the armed forces. While Mexican Americans in Los Angeles made up only a tenth of the city's population, they suffered a fifth of the city's wartime casualties. About 1 million African Americans also served in the military. African American soldiers lived and worked in segregated units and were limited mostly to non-combat roles. After much protest, African Americans did finally see combat beginning in April of 1943. Asian Americans took part in the struggle as well. More than 13,000 Chinese Americans, or about 1 of every 5 adult males, joined the armed forces. In addition, 33,000 Japanese Americans put on uniforms. Of these, several thousand volunteered to serve as spies and interpreters in the Pacific War. "During battles," wrote an admiring officer, "they crawled up close enough to be able to hear Japanese officers' commands and to make verbal translation to our soldiers." Some 25,000 Native Americans enlisted in the armed services too, including 800 women. Their willingness to serve led the Saturday Evening Post to comment, "We would not need the selective service if all volunteered like Indians." Part 2. A production miracle. In early 1942, American newspapers reported the end of the automobile production for private use. The last car to roll off an automaker's assembly line was a gray sedan with Victory trim, that is, without chrome-plated parts. This was just one more sign that the war would affect most every aspect of life. The industrial response. Within weeks of the shutdown in production, the nation's automobile plants had been retooled to produce tanks, planes, boats, and command cars. They were not alone. Across the nation, factories were quickly converted to war production. The maker of mechanical pencils turned out bomb parts. A bedspread manufacturer made mosquito netting. A soft drink company converted from filling bottles with liquid to filling shells with explosives. Meanwhile, shipyards and defense plants expanded with dizzying speed. By the end of 1942, industrialist Henry J. Kaiser had built 7 massive new shipyards that turned out Liberty ships, cargo carriers, tankers, troop transports, and baby aircraft carriers at an astonishing rate. Late that year, Kaiser invited reporters to Way 1 in his Richmond, California shipyard to watch as workers assembled Hull 440, a Liberty ship, in a record-breaking 4 days. Writer Alice Mano Kramer described the first day and night of construction. A personal voice, Alice Mano Kramer. At the stroke of 12, Way 1 exploded into life. Crews of workers, like a champion football team, swarmed into their places in line. Within 60 seconds, the keel was swinging into position. Hull 440 was going up. The speed of production was unbelievable. At midnight Saturday, an empty way. At midnight Sunday, a full-grown hull met the eyes of graveyard workers as they came on shift. Before the fourth day was up, 25,000 amazed spectators watched as Hull 440 slid into the water. How could such a ship be built so fast? Kaiser used prefabricated or factory-made parts that could be quickly assembled in his shipyards. Equally important were his workers, who worked at record speeds. Labor's contribution. When the war began, defense contractors warned the Selective Service System that the nation did not have enough workers to meet both its military and industrial needs. They were wrong. By 1944, despite the draft, nearly 18 million workers were laboring in war industries, 3 times as many as 1941. More than 6 million of these new workers were women. At first, war industries feared that most women lacked the necessary stamina for factory work and were reluctant to hire them. But once women proved they could operate welding torches or riveting guns as well as men, employers could not hire enough of them, especially since women earned only about 60% as much as men doing the same jobs. Defense plants also hired more than 2 million minority workers during the war years. Like women, minorities faced strong prejudice at first. Before the war, 75% of defense contractors simply refused to hire African Americans, while another 15% employed them only in menial jobs. "Negroes will be considered only as janitors," declared the general manager of North American Aviation. "It is the company policy not to employ them as mechanics and aircraft workers." To protest such discrimination, both in the military and in industry, A. Philip Randolph, president and founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and the nation's most respected African American labor leader, organized a march on Washington. Randolph called on African Americans everywhere to come to the Capitol on July 1, 1941, and to march under the banner, "We loyal colored Americans demand the right to work and fight for our country." Fearing that the march might provoke white resentment or violence, President Roosevelt called Randolph to the White House and asked him to back down. "I'm sorry, Mr. President," the labor leader said, "the march cannot be called off." Roosevelt then asked, "How many people do you plan to bring?" Randolph replied, 100,000, Mr. President. Roosevelt was stunned. Even half that number of African American protesters would be far more than Washington, still a very segregated city, could feed, house, and transport. In the end, it was Roosevelt, not Randolph, who backed down. In return for Randolph's promise to cancel the march, the president issued an executive order calling on employers and labor unions to provide for the full and equitable participation of all workers in defense industries without discrimination because of race, creed, color, or national origin. Mobilization of scientists. That same year, in 1941, Roosevelt created the Office of Scientific Research and Development, or OSRD, to bring scientists into the war effort. The OSRD spurred improvements in radar and sonar, new technologies for locating submarines underwater. It encouraged the use of pesticides like DDT to fight insects. As a result, U.S. soldiers were probably first in history to be relatively free from body lice. The OSRD also pushed the development of miracle drugs such as penicillin that saved countless lives on and off the battlefield. The most significant achievement of the OSRD, however, was the secret development of a new weapon, the atomic bomb. Interest in such a weapon began in 1939 after German scientists succeeded in splitting uranium atoms, releasing an enormous amount of energy. This news prompted physicist and German refugee Albert Einstein to write a letter to President Roosevelt, warning that the Germans could use their discovery to construct a weapon of enormous destructive power. Roosevelt responded by creating an advisory committee on uranium to study the new discovery. In 1941, the committee reported that it would take from 3 to 5 years to build an atomic bomb. Hoping to shorten that time, the OSRD set up an intensive program in 1942 to develop a bomb as quickly as possible. Because much of the early research was performed at Columbia University in Manhattan, the Manhattan Project became the code name for research work that extended across the country. the federal government takes control. Part 3. As war production increased, there were fewer consumer products available for purchase. Much factory production was earmarked for the war. With demand increasing and supplies dropping, prices seemed likely to shoot upwards. Economic controls. Roosevelt responded to this threat by creating the Office of Price Administration, or OPA. The OPA fought inflation by freezing prices on most goods. Congress also raised income tax rates and extended the tax to millions of people who had never paid it before. The higher taxes reduced consumer demand on scarce goods by leaving workers with less to spend. In addition, the government encouraged Americans to use their extra cash to buy war bonds. As a result of these measures, inflation remained below 30%, about half that of World War I, for the entire period of World War II. Besides controlling inflation, the government needed to ensure that the armed forces and war industries received the resources they needed to win the war. The War Production Board, or WPB, assumed that responsibility. The WPB decided which companies would convert from peacetime to wartime production and allocated raw materials to key industries. The WPB also organized drives to collect scrap iron, tin cans, paper, rags, and cooking fat for recycling into war goods. Across America, children scoured attics, cellars, garages, vacant lots, and back alleys looking for useful junk. During one 5-month-long paper drive in Chicago, school children collected 36 million pounds of old paper, about 65 pounds per child. Rationing. In addition, the OPA set up a system for rationing, or establishing fixed allotments of goods deemed essential for the military. Under this system, households received ration books with coupons to be used for buying such scarce goods as meat, shoes, sugar, coffee, and gasoline. Gas rationing was particularly hard on those who had lived in western regions, where driving was the only way to get around. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt sympathized with their complaints. "To tell the people in the West not to use their cars," she observed, "means that these people may never see another soul for weeks and weeks, nor have a way of getting a sick person to a doctor." Most Americans accepted rationing as a personal contribution to the war effort. Workers carpooled or rode bicycles. Families coped with shortages of everything from tires to toys. Inevitably, some cheated by hoarding scarce goods or by purchasing them through the black market, where rationed items could be bought illegally without coupons at inflated prices. While people tightened their belts at home, millions of other Americans put their lives on the line in air, sea, and land battles on the other side of the world.